Welcome, my dear friends, to this edition of the History of Christianity. We're on part 40 today. This is the last part of this first series on the history of Christianity. We began with the end of the New Testament, and we've gone now through the dawn of the Protestant Reformation. So today, we're going to talk about the beginnings of colonial Christianity. We begin by looking at Spain and the role that it played in the New World. During the end of the Middle Ages and during the time of the Protestant Reformation, Catholicism enjoyed a rapid expansion into Spain and Portugal. After the discovery of the New World by Columbus in 1492, European settlers began colonizing. So this is information that anybody that has any knowledge of history, world history, or even U.S. history, you know that these events take place. And a big part of this is the movement through colonialization of Christianity into the New World. Religious policies in the new lands followed the patterns established during the Middle Ages. In a series of bulls from 1493 to 1510, Popes Alexander VI and Julius II gave enormous authority to the Spanish crown, giving them the right of royal patronage over the church in the new land. So what does that mean? This gave kings the right to nominate and thereby basically appoint bishops and other high ecclesiastical officers for the New World. So the kings that sent people into these new lands were given an enormous amount of authority to appoint who would be the officials in the church. So we go back to that same problem that the church has been having, in which the secular authorities are having too much of a role to play in church affairs. The result was that the church in Spanish America had very little direct interaction with Rome, becoming practically a national church under the leadership of the Spanish kings. The church officials elected by the crown were little more than political appointees, having little care or knowledge of ecclesiastical duties. They showed little concern for the plight of the masses in Spanish America. So the church officials that are coming over, the people that are being appointed, especially high in leadership, they're coming in as more or less just an arm of the king. They're there more to do political things and civil things than they are to take care of the needs of people. And there certainly are a lot of needs of people at this time in the New World. As more and more people come over to colonize, there is a steady diet of mistreatment that's going on with these people. They needed someone to help them. And in that role, the church should have been, they really weren't. And a big reason for that is the leadership in place. However, there were also Franciscan, Dominican, and Jesuit missionaries. These missionaries lived among the people and knew their needs. The friars became the defenders of the natives against the depredations of European settlers. So there was a group in the church that did help the people, and that was the people in the lower echelons of the ecclesiastical structure, those that were the missionaries, those that were the friars. They lived with the people. They weren't in the high places. They weren't separated with their political power. They were down on the ground with the people, and they were the ones, as we go through this, you'll see, they were the ones who were advocates for the people when they were being mistreated. A sermon preached in Santo Domingo in 1511 by the Dominican Antonio Montesinos marked the first open protest against the exploitation of the natives. So as people are coming over, they're mistreating some of the native population when they come in and to colonize. And one of the first people that protested against this, at least from the church's viewpoint, is this guy, Montesinos, and he preached against the exploitation of the natives. The main issue of the protest was the system of encomiendas, meaning trusts. It was forbidden to enslave the natives, but in order to civilize them and teach them Christian doctrine, groups of them were entrusted to a settler. In exchange, the natives would work for him, making them slaves by default. So the system in place, the political system, says you can't go in and enslave the natives, but we want to go in and we want to help the natives. We're going to teach them civility. We're going to teach them Christian doctrine. We're going to entrust them to you to be their teachers, to help care for them. And so these native people would be entrusted, in quotes, to a settler, but really they would be required to do work for them, and they really became slaves by default. They weren't treated very well, and this was a terrible system for the natives that were there. The protest against this practice finally made its way to the court in Spain. Bartolomé de las Casas, a man who had an encomienda, had a change of heart in 1514. He gave up his encomienda and openly declared that Christian faith was incompatible to this system of exploitation. Las Casas traveled to Spain and acquired legislation to stop the abuses, but the authorities in the New World were unwilling to enforce the new laws. So Las Casas went over. He let the courts in Spain know that there's mistreatment going on. They enacted laws to stop it, but when he came back with those laws, there wasn't anybody to enforce it. They didn't want to do that in the New World, and there wasn't going to be an army sent from Spain to do it. So he had the law, but the law wasn't going to be enforced or followed. Las Casas fought the fight until his death in 1566. Though new laws which were enacted as the result of the protest of La Casa and others were never followed, there were many who took up the cause. Throughout the colonial period, there were Christians in Spanish America who protested against the exploitation of the natives. So even though the church didn't do everything that they could or they should have done, especially when it comes to the higher powers, to stop these practices, there were still those in the church, Christian missionaries, Christian friars, those that lived among the people that protested against the exploitation of these natives. We also see some similar problems in the Caribbean. Columbus returned on his second voyage and found that natives in Hispaniola had revolted. Columbus responded by ordering his lieutenants to cut the ears and nose of any who would not submit. So Columbus comes in, he's basically being a tyrant and very badly mistreating people in this case. Reports of these actions by Columbus reached Isabella across the sea. Columbus was deposed and taken back in chains, so he had to actually return because of the way he was treating these people, and was taken back as a prisoner because of the way he had behaved. Those who followed him treated the islanders no better, so those that came after him to take his place, they didn't treat him any better. Columbus had to leave, but the rest of them didn't. They stayed around, and it just kept on mistreating these natives. The natives were ordered to pay a quarterly tax to the Spaniards. Those who could not were enslaved. So right back to being enslaved again. In the end, forced labor, diseases imported by the Spanish, and mass suicides destroyed most of the native population. So in the Caribbean, the natives that were there were almost completely wiped out because of the colonizing Spanish that came in. This led the Spanish to import black slaves. By 1533, tens of thousands of Africans were being imported as slaves. The few theologians who objected did so not on the basis of opposition to slavery, but because they had doubts as to how the profits should be distributed. So here's a problem that we can easily fix. We can't enslave the native population. Oh, you don't want us to mistreat them? Well, we'll just basically wipe them out, and we'll bring in black slaves who we can treat as slaves, who it's okay to act as slaves because they are slaves. We're bringing them in as slaves. So they bring them in, they take the place of these natives, and then you've got this huge population of people from Africa living there that were imported as slaves and treated as slaves, and they basically took over the part of the natives who were more or less wiped out. What happened in the Caribbean was repeated throughout the Spanish colonies. In areas in which the native population was scarce, black slaves took their place. So at this time in these countries, the New World and South America and the islands around it, there's a large number of native people that are either leaving because of the colonization, or they're being killed, or whatever it may be. They're not around anymore. So the black slaves are being brought in to take their place. As you can imagine, a lot is going to take place in Mexico. The tone was set for Spanish religious policies in Mexico by Cortez. He destroyed the idols of the various tribes he visited, except for the Tlaxcalans, whose support he needed. An odd combination of expediency and financial zeal characterized Spanish religious policies in Mexico. Cortez did, however, request that friars be sent to live among the natives. 12 were sent. They faced the difficult task of living among a people who resented the Spanish. So with everything that Cortez did to take over this country, he did recognize one important thing that a lot of the other leaders that came in didn't recognize. He recognized that the people there, the native people there, needed the church to help them. They needed somebody that would come in and be sympathetic and be on their side. And he also realized that if those people that came in were the higher echelon people that were political appointees, they weren't going to help the people. So what Cortez did was he recommended that they send missionaries, that they send these friars to come in, because he knew they would live among the people and therefore they would be sympathetic to the needs of the people. So in that sense, he did something good that most of the other leaders at this time that came in to South America did not recognize and did not care about. Many natives did quickly convert to Christianity. Having seen the Spanish easily subdue the native population, they reached the conclusion that the Christian God had defeated their own gods. Therefore, the natives wanted to gain the support of the powerful Christian God. So a lot of them did come to Christianity, and in some sense it was done because they thought, okay, we have our God, you have your God. Well, your God beat us. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been able to defeat us. So we want to get in, we want to get a good word in with the God that could come in and wipe us out or defeat us. And so a lot of them became Christian based on that reasoning. Little by little, the 12 friars and those who followed them gained the support of the native population. With hundreds often converting in a single day, the friars sometimes sprinkled several of them at the same time. This led jealous priests to accuse the friars of oversimplifying baptism. Pope John Paul III settled the dispute. He declared that there had been no sin in the previous baptisms, but that from that time on, certain directives must be followed. Yet there still remained strife among the friars and the priests for several generations. So there was some jealousy that was going on with what you call the secular priests, which means they weren't part of a monastic order. They were kind of on their own. And then these friars who were missionaries working with the people, there was some jealousy because they saw the role that the friars played among the people. They were a lot more respected and listened to than these priests. And they didn't like that. So they came in and tried to cause a dispute. Pope Paul III settled the dispute, but it didn't mean that the strife went away. There was still tension there between those friars working on the ground with the people and these secular priests. The first bishop and eventual archbishop of Mexico was Juan de Zumarraga. He was convinced that the church needed reform. He had a printing press taken to Mexico, the first in the Western Hemisphere, in order to educate the natives. He also took steps for the founding of the University of Mexico. He was an ardent defender of the natives from those who would exploit them. He did, however, have little tolerance for what he considered heresy. From 1536 to 1543, he had 131 people tried for heresy. In 1539, a gathering of church leaders opened to the natives the possibility of receiving the 4 lowest levels of holy orders, but none that had sacramental functions. So in 1539, there started to be a little bit of an opening for the natives to get involved in the church leadership. Wasn't a big step forward, but it was a step forward, and yet there were still some that didn't even like that. The Dominicans disagreed. They declared the natives should not be ordained or educated at all. They thought it was a bad idea to give these people education. They'll just use it against us. Let's not let them into the church. Let's not give them education. Let's keep them out. And that was what the Dominicans thought. And of course, others disagreed with that. In 1588, a royal order opened both priestly orders and monastic vows to natives. So 1588, things changed. The natives got an opportunity to get a much bigger role, but seemingly a lot more of them came in than people were comfortable with, because in 1636, the king lamented that too many were being ordained, so they backed off of allowing that to continue. That brings us to the legend of the Virgin of Guadalupe. The legend states that the Virgin appeared to an Indian, Juan Diego, with a message for Zumarraga. The bishop did not believe what Diego told him until a series of miracles forced him to believe. As a result, and under instructions from the Virgin, a chapel was built at the place of the apparitions. Historians have not been able to find any evidence that this story is true in examining records of the time. So this legend of the Virgin of Guadalupe is huge in the culture. It was a big thing for the people of this day because it basically pitted the natives against the church leadership, the people that had come in as the settlers or the conquerors of the area. And the legend had the Virgin side with the natives. That was a big deal because here is the Virgin Mary who's taken the side not of church leadership, but of the native population. In the end, the story serves as a vindication of the oppressed natives against the Spanish bishop. The bishop had to do what the Indian told him, and that's probably one of the reasons that this story has so ingrained itself in the culture and is still around to this day, even though you can't find any historical record whatsoever, any reference to this, nothing that would lend credibility to the story being correct. Although you know that is not necessarily always the only test for something being true. In this case, you can at least look very skeptically on it, and yet it's a big deal. And the biggest reason for that is it gives the native people someone on their side. Even though the church itself didn't necessarily always take their side or didn't even primarily take their side, in this case, the Virgin Mary, somebody that is in as high as you can get among human beings, has taken the side of the native population against the very church leadership, and that's a big deal. The Virgin of Guadalupe became the symbol and rallying point of Mexican national sentiment against any form of foreign intervention. The area that is now Central America and Panama drew the attention of Spanish authorities from an early date. By 1509, efforts at conquest began. This area became known as Golden Castile because of the gold found there. In this area, the natives were mistreated as well. Eventually, most of the natives fled and fought as guerrillas against the conquistadors. Many Spaniards died because food was so scarce. The bishop and the Franciscan missionaries returned to Spain in protest. So, just so you understand, the reason the food was so scarce is because the natives refused to stay and be enslaved. They left. They got out of there. They took to the jungle. They became guerrillas. They were out fighting against these people, and they certainly weren't producing food for them. So all of a sudden, this group comes in thinking they're going to have a population of native people to help them survive, and that population just disappears and leaves them high and dry. They're in trouble now, and a bunch of them died, and then it got so bad that even the bishop and the missionaries that had come there, they went back to Spain to protest things that had happened because it just ended up being such a big mess. It would be decades before there would be any semblance of order. The most interesting character in the early history of the church in Central America was Juan de Estrada Ravago. He joined an expedition to Costa Rica. He learned the language of the natives and mostly refrained from violence against them, He traveled throughout the area teaching the Christian faith, baptizing people, and building churches. He also bought food, clothes, and seed for the natives and the settlers, and he did that out of his own pocket. Through his efforts and the missionaries who joined him, the church developed rapidly. By the end of the 16th century, most of the original inhabitants of Central America called themselves Christians. So this fella did a really good job. Juan de Estrada Ravago. He went out. He was actually going to go back home. And at the last minute, he found out about this expedition and it needed some financing. So he came in and he financed it to the point he actually became the leader of the expedition to Costa Rica. And under his leadership, they went in and actually did some good things for the native people there. He mostly refrained from violence. It makes you laugh when you think about it, but honestly, that's really good for this time. Almost nobody refrained from violence, but he almost completely did, although there are a few situations where he didn't. But it seems like he really did have a heart for people. He wanted to teach them the truths of the gospel and the church. And he also wanted to take care of their physical needs. He's getting clothes for them, seeds for them to plant, food to help them, and the settlers as well. And it did really make the church spread rapidly. It made a huge difference when somebody came in from outside that actually had a good heart for people that they're meeting, rather than just using them for their own ends or just killing them if they get in the way. And that made the church grow rapidly in the area. And it also led to the vast majority of the original inhabitants of Central America becoming Christians by the 16th century. That brings us to Colombia and Venezuela. The conquest of the coast of present-day Colombia was first attempted in 1508, but was not successful until 1525. Soon after the founding of the first cities, the transplanting of the Spanish church was completed. The two great Christian figures of this area were Saints Luis Beltran and Pedro Claver. Luis Beltran was one of the hundreds of missionaries who came to bring Christianity to the natives. He came to the New World in 1562, desiring to reach the millions who needed someone to minister to them. He preached against the injustices being done to the native population. Eventually, he returned to Spain. He gained many admirers for his work. He died in 1581. In 1671, he was named a saint, the first with any connection to the New World. Pedro Claver was born in 1580. From early youth, he decided he would be a missionary in the New World. He arrived in Cartagena in 1622. In order to minister to the black slaves, he had his monastery buy a number of slaves to use as interpreters. So just a word about Pedro Claver. He came in with a real heart for these people. Since he was a young man, he wanted to be a missionary to the New World. He had heard about missionaries going there. The people there needed someone to preach the gospel, and he had a desire to do that. He was not looked on very favorably by his leaders, even in the time he was coming up, getting prepared to go. They thought he wasn't very intelligent. They had a lot of bad things to say about him. But regardless of whether that's true or not, this man ended up doing some tremendous work. And he didn't get treated very well because of it. Some among his fellow Jesuits persisted in treating the interpreters as slaves. Claver insisted that they were brothers in Christ and eventually forced the other Jesuits to agree. So he recognized that among the slaves there are a bunch of different languages. People that were being enslaved from Africa were coming from a lot of different tribes, and they had different languages. So he couldn't just learn one language and speak to them. He needed people to help him as interpreters so that he could speak to a lot of different groups rather than trying to learn all their languages. And so he decided, well, why don't we just buy them as slaves? They're slaves, let's buy them. And then we can bring them in and do whatever we want to with them. And so he brings these guys in, and he basically makes them his interpreters. Understand, they're not, in his view, slaves. They're just, that's the way he can get them to come. So he doesn't look at them as slaves or treat them like slaves, although some of his Jesuit brethren wanted to treat them as slaves. Claver stepped in and said, no, these men are our brothers in Christ, and we need to treat them as such. And even though they didn't agree with him, he forced them into doing that. Claver and his interpreters met the slaves as soon as the ships came to shore. He ministered to them by carrying out the dead, when many of them died on the trip, and so they would carry out the dead ones. He would take the sick to a small hospital that he built near where the ships would come to shore, because he knew a lot would be sick when they came in. And then he would provide food and clothes for the rest. He then would begin communicating the gospel to those who were well enough to listen. He sat among the slaves on the ground. That's a big deal. These people, these Europeans that came over, they didn't put themselves on the level of the natives. They certainly didn't put themselves on the level of a slave. Claver came in and sat right in the middle of them. They didn't even understand what was going on. This was so weird and so out of character, they could not figure it out. But here's what he did. He did bring a chair in, but he didn't sit in the chair. He had his black interpreter who used to be a slave. That man was put in the chair. So right off the bat, he sent in the message to these people, I don't look at you as being under me. I will sit among you. It's not right that anybody would treat you differently because of whatever. And I'm going to sit down on the ground where you are. So he's trying to communicate to them a sense of, I feel like we're on the same level. I want you to trust me. I want you to hear what I have to say. And I'm not going to treat you or mistreat you the way you've been mistreated in the past. He simply communicated the faith to them. I think he did a great job. I've never heard this way of explaining the Trinity. I've heard a lot of different ways of explaining the Trinity, but I've never heard this one. He explained the Trinity by folding a handkerchief so that three corners could be seen. I guess he held it in his hand so that you could just see the three corners. And then he would open his hand and show that there was just a single piece of cloth. So you've got three individual things, but you open your hand and you find out it's actually all one. So I thought that was a really good way of explaining the Trinity. I've never heard that method before. So he came up with that as a way to help explain the truth of God's Word to this native population, and it really helped. Claver also established a leprosarium for slaves who were expelled once they showed signs of the disease leprosy. So when they would come over, it tended to be a lot of the slaves would get leprosy. It tended to pass through the slave community. And what did an owner do with a slave who has leprosy? Well, they're not going to get better, and you're not going to be able to use them for work, so they would just kick them out. They would just turn them loose. They had nowhere to go. They were sick. Claver established a community for them to help take care of them. Claver soon let it be known that when he heard confessions, he would follow in inverse order to that of society, first listening to the slaves, then the poor, and finally the children. Those who did not fit into any of those categories needed to find another confessor. So Claver set himself up as the man who cared for the poor, those in society who were not well treated, even the children, and he didn't have really a whole lot of time for anybody else. He felt rightly so that the other group, the people that were the settlers coming in that had wealth and had everything they needed, there were plenty of people for them to go to. He was the guy for the other group. Those in white society either ignored or discouraged him. A lot of them tried to get him to quit and go home. But as he lay dying, many who had scorned him came to see a saint who was about to pass. They recognized the work he had done. And even the ones who didn't like him and treated him derisively, when they knew he was on his deathbed, they realized the work he had done and that he was going to be looked favorably on by history. So they came in. The cream of society came expecting to leave with a relic. This to me is just heartbreaking. Claver was not even allowed to keep his crucifix when a marquis declared he wanted it. So this wealthy dude comes in and says, "Oh, I want something. I like that crucifix." So Claver was ordered to give it up to this man who stood against everything Claver had lived his life for. He still had to do it. He died in 1654 and was made a saint more than 200 years later. So here was a guy who gave himself for people that nobody cared about. He actually lived out what he believed. And as we see so often through history, he got completely mistreated and just people despised him for it. Yet at the end of his life, as he lay dying, these same people that just treated him like the scum of the earth, that like he wasn't even a piece of dirt under their feet, they came to see him when it was popular to do it, and they wanted to take the little bit of stuff he had, to the point that even his crucifix gets taken away from him. But you know what? We don't know the name of that man, but we know the name of Pedro Claver because his life meant something, and he'll be remembered through eternity because of the work he did to give of himself the way that Jesus Christ would for the needs of those who did not have anyone else to stand up for them. The western part of South America was controlled by the Incas. The empire included all or part of Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. Francisco Pizarro conquered the Incas. Atahualpa was captured in 1532, but Indian resistance continued until 1780. While the church supported conquest and exploitation, some of its members raised vigorous voices of protest. Even many of the friars who came were corrupted by the wealth of Peru. The natives also began killing those who were baptized, seeing it as symbolic of subjugation to the invaders. So it became, at some point, it came that the native population started to not even want the church folks around. They didn't want anybody converting to Christianity because to them, it meant that you're giving in to these invaders. And you can understand why you'd think that way. You're being invaded and taken over and killed by people. You don't want to just be going along and doing what they're doing. And so there was a lot of resentment. Although this area was difficult to reach, it produced 4 who would be recognized as saints. Toribio Alfonso de Mogrovejo was made Archbishop of Lima in 1581. He was known for preparing a catechism that was translated and became the main means of Christian instruction in Spanish America for 300 years. Rosa of Lima followed the path of ascetic mysticism. Martin de Perez spent many years taking care of the sick and planting fruit trees along the countryside, hoping that one day they would help someone who was hungry. So he planted fruit trees, not for his own benefit, but thinking somewhere down the road, somebody's going to be walking along here and be hungry, and here's a fruit tree to give them something to eat. Francisco Solano claimed to have an apocalyptic vision in 1604. He ran through the streets proclaiming the judgment of God. Many people flocked to the churches to confess their sins. So what are some conclusions we can draw about the spread of Christianity among those who were colonizing the New World? The early story of Christianity in these lands during the period of colonial expansion is not an inspiring one. A lot of atrocities took place. It would take many years before the negative consequences of such beginnings could be overcome. While Spain and Portugal were building vast overseas empires and planting Roman Catholicism in distant lands, the Protestant Reformation was taking place in Europe. So the events that we're going to get to in the next series are taking place while all this is going on, and that is the Protestant Reformation. In the next series, in this study, we will return to Europe and resume the narrative of the quest for Reformation. We will learn of the leaders who rose up and of those who gave their lives to that quest. So this is the last section of this first part of our study. It's been a great time going back over this material, things that I've learned before but have largely forgotten in many cases, to be reminded of it and study it again and just see the wonder of what God did through the generations to bring his church through some times that it looked like it wouldn't even survive. And there were even some times that it maybe, if we were being honest, didn't deserve to survive. And yet as God's people, and he preserved it and brought it to the point that it's at now, but it's at a crisis time. If you remember things that are going on in Western Europe, the church is very corrupt and a lot of people are fed up with it. And there's going to be something happen. There's going to be a change, and it's going to be more than just some church leaders giving lip service. There's a movement that started, and it doesn't start with just one person. It's already out there. It's in the grassroots level. And there is a need that people have seen that things have got to change. And so that's what we'll be studying in the next part of our series, which is the history of Christianity from the Reformation to the present day. We will have one more episode. It's not an official part of this series, but it's a bonus episode, the history of Christmas. I'm working on that now. Hope to have it out before Christmas, obviously for you. And I hope that you'll get an opportunity to listen to that. I think you'll really enjoy finding out more information about some of where our Christmas traditions come from and just seeing how Christmas has evolved from being a holiday that was largely ignored by Christianity for years, and even once established, not celebrated very vigorously, to now becoming the #1 holiday in the entire world, and probably not really as much relevant to the religious aspect of it as it is the commercial aspect. But we'll get into all that. I hope you'll enjoy it. Thanks for sticking with me if you have through this entire series, 40 episodes. It's been a great time, and I look forward to speaking to you again a few weeks from now as we begin the second part, the history of Christianity from the Reformation to the present day. God bless.